from 1950 through 1973-ish, a researcher named John Calhoun did a series of studies on rats and mice. He was fascinated with rodents, and he set up these universes, he called them, 4.5 feet cubes. He did his first at his house, and that became a problem real quick. You can imagine rats and mice. I mean, if you got one mouse, you got 17 of them, and the next day you got 134 of them. And somehow he secured funding, he got his studies, and he did studies called population density behavioral studies. So he wanted to study these mice, and primarily it was mice. There were rats too earlier on. But his crowning achievement was Universe 25. It was a 4.5 foot cube. He started out with 8 albino mice, and I think it was like 265 apartments, we'll call them, on the sides of the walls of this cube. And they were accessible by little tunnels, kind of like a prison, but it's way nicer. You have to understand that in the wild, rodent mortality is really high, especially in the young. I mean, you can get eaten by predators, you can starve to death, you can freeze to death in the cold, you can run across the occasional human glue board or trap. I mean, there's all kinds of problems for mice in the wild, and therefore their young don't live very long, by and large. Well, Calhoun factored all this stuff in. So he fed the mice basically whenever they wanted to be fed. I think there was a system in place, you know, he studied it out in the 24 universes previously. And so he kind of knew about when they start getting hungry. And, you know, by Universe 25, he had this down to a science. So it was climate controlled. There was no more fear of being frozen out in the winter. The food was just unending. Anytime they wanted to eat, they could eat. There were no predators introduced. Just the mice, started with 8. And by the top of the study, even though population had declined quite a bit, or not population, but the breeding of these mice had declined quite a bit. The maximum population was about 2,200. So he gave them climate control. He gave them all the food they could handle. He even gave them fresh reams of paper so they could build a fluffy little nest if they wanted to in their apartment. Mice got her made. There's social hierarchies with rodents even. There's these alpha males, and they establish dominance primarily by fighting. And when they become the victor, the big mouse on the block, they establish harems of female mice. And they're in control of that. And the ones that cannot establish dominance, Calhoun called them dropouts. Now in the wild, these quote-unquote dropouts would just scurry off to some little crack or crevice somewhere, or they just go to a new place altogether and just start over. Maybe try it again, maybe sharpen up the old mouse fighting skills. But in this 4.5 foot cubicle in Universe 25, they couldn't do that. And what he found out was that they gathered in the center of the floor. They waited to be fed, covered in scars and bite marks and all this stuff. And over time, they just break out in random acts of violence, just massive mouse brawls and fighting for no apparent reason. Stop me if any of this sounds familiar. As the studies went on, fewer and fewer of the females had much interest in breeding. And the ones that did, oftentimes would simply forget about their babies. Pups, they call them in the studies. Apparently a baby mouse is a pup. They just fall off, you know, they'd be latched on feeding and they'd just fall off. And the female mice would just, you know, because ain't nobody got time for that. A lot of them wouldn't even carry their babies to term. And like I said, the ones that did just didn't seem to care. Those were the middle class. And we've discussed the lower class. And then there was the upper echelon of mice. And Calhoun referred to these as the beautiful ones. And they would socially isolate themselves really high up in the mouse Utopia in Universe 25. And they would just sit and preen themselves and repeatedly lick their fur for hours on end. They had no interest in socially communicating with the other mice. They had no interest. And even though they spent all this time self-grooming, they really had no propensity to cohabitate. They had no interest in sex, and they had no interest in commingling with the other species. They just cared about their appearance. The dropouts on the bottom, the floor of the cage, seemed to lack a meaningful place in society. They tended to lash out in violence. Does any of this sound familiar at all? Like I said before, the maximum population of this mouse Utopia grew to about 2,200, but then the birth rate started declining. Mind you, all this time they're being fed. They have no concerns about the weather. They have everything we could ever want: food, water, shelter, controlled climate. But the population maxed at 2,200, and this started declining more and more and more. By 1973, Universe 25, this mouse Utopia, was completely extinct. There wasn't a single mouse alive yet. The whole colony collapsed. Now, all kinds of researchers researched the research, and there were a whole slew of varying opinions and possibilities and quote-unquote research. One guy said it was a population problem. It's just too much crowding. And that really is where we got in the mid-1970s, this narrative that there's an overpopulation problem on Earth, and we got to do something about all these people because it's going to cause our demise and collapse. That's where that took hold from. Another woman looked at the research and concluded on her own research that it wasn't so much a population density problem as a fair distribution problem. I suppose that can be argued, but they all had equal access to food. The only distributor was Calhoun. He's the guy feeding them, and he didn't break this up. They had to fend for themselves when it came to the food, but it was readily available. So I think you can kind of toss that one out. Under such conditions, there was a very small portion of these mice that actually became smarter as the study went on. And the dropouts, trying to avoid the mouse society, Universe 25 basically, because they're outcasts and they're not alphas, they can't get the chick mice, and so they would start tunneling in the dirt floor of Universe 25. And they're kicking all this dirt out behind them, and then other mice would take it, and apparently, I don't know if they had an escape route for them or whatever the case, they got rid of the dirt. It was a necessary thing to make tunnels. But some of those mice in the dropouts came up with the idea to, rather than back and forth with all these little, paws full of dirt, or however mice carry dirt, I don't know. They came up with the idea to roll the dirt into balls that they could push. It saves a lot of trips. So at least in part of the study, some of them, even though in the bottom class, the very bottom, the dropouts, did get smarter as the study went along. The trouble with that is, especially in the research part, people tend to see what they want to see. We make conclusions based on what we take in. And what we take in might be the exact same information as what somebody else is taking in. But our outcome of our research is totally different, and isn't that fascinating? This narrative that, oh, there's too many people on the earth, and the earth is too small and can't sustain all this. If you think the earth is small, you should walk it. Walk your state. From east to west or north to south, doesn't matter. And I'm talking about on foot. Walk that thing and tell me how small the earth is. Get back to me with it. In the United States of America, we have farmers that get paid by the United States government through the subsidies program to not grow food. And you're telling me it's unsustainable. Well, that's fascinating. I find that incredibly interesting. As I find the mouse Utopia studies interesting. By 1973, all of them are dead. Every single one of them. Mostly from a lack of breeding. Population rates are down, not only in America, but across the globe. There's this replacement theory they talk about. It's not even a theory, it's a thing. The old die off, and the young are born kind of as a replacement. It's the propagation of human life. as things are currently, the United States isn't replacing. It's dying off. I think the number was 2.3. Basically every couple needs to have about 2.3 kids to replace the generations that are aging off the planet, we'll say. And the current number, I believe, in America is somewhere around 2.1 and declining. In Japan, it's way under that. I mean, the whole civilization is facing an eye-opening outcome as we go along here. I don't know. The whole thing is interesting to me. It really is fascinating. As is the mouse Utopia, Universe 25. I thought it was interesting to bring that to you. And hopefully you have a good New Year if I don't see you before that. Thanks for watching. I do appreciate your time. I'll see you next time.